let me, if I may, just try and give you some idea from my perspective about what it will take to prepare for the future. Let me frame this with 4 questions. What priority do you give to thinking about the future? Is it intellectually stimulating but a bit irrelevant for our day-to-day work? How much time do we give to strategic thinking, to thinking about the kind of objectives we want in the longer term and how one gets there? And while we all know, as our chair said, that the world is changing, how much do these changes reflect what you do? How are they encapsulated in your plans? And just a final question. What happens and what are the consequences for you, for us, if you really do not think in longer strategic terms? In search of some of the answers, at least some of the suggestions I would like to pose, let me first of all look at the changing nature of humanitarian crises. And then take a look at this in the context of the changing global context. And then finally, let me ask, and let me suggest, what the 21st century humanitarian organization needs to look like. When one talks about types of disasters, let me just preface my remarks by the following. In 1936, the United States government asked the U.S. National Academy of Sciences to look into a 50-year perspective to say what will be. And they did, in 1936, identify some critical factors. They identified new forms of agriculture. They identified what would become penicillin. But far more interesting is what they didn't identify. They didn't identify the whole nuclear revolution. There was no mention of cybernetics, of the internet, of the issue of the whole question of the whole cybernetic context. So I use that as a warning. Let me suggest some of the kind of crises that you as humanitarian actors will have to think about. But let me preface these with, from the very beginning, all of these might really not be what the future holds. What types of crises might we be thinking about? How about existential risks? How about things such as solar superstorms? All of a sudden, if you like, explosions in the sun begin to knock out the whole system that we have in terms of computers, cybernetics, etc. And the lesson here is not that they've never happened before, but rather we have made ourselves so increasingly vulnerable to these kind of events. How about artificial intelligence? Is that a threat? When all of a sudden one finds that the kind of artificial computers intelligence that one makes is actually outthinking the human being, to what effect? Implausible? Perhaps not. And how about nanotechnology? Tiny, tiny elements that now can begin to eat and survive on Earth and oxygen material, which will enable them to expand, but by going into this kind of survival mode, will undermine what we as human beings survive on. And now as we look at what's happening in North Korea, hopefully without any long-term consequences, can one really say that we will not have to face major nuclear confrontation? Now, if all of these seem a bit far-fetched, a bit existential, let me get to something which I think is far more immediate and far more plausible. How about cybernetic failures? How about those satellites that provide us with the capacity for internet exchange? And if these are knocked out by small pieces of matter from asteroids, what actually happens now here on Earth? And you'll say, well, that's a developed country problem. And what you'll really see is, no, this is a global problem. This will mean that all the exchange that we have in terms of social networking, all the exchange that we have in terms of cash transfers, all the exchange that we have in terms of the way hospitals, cities, urban areas, etc., function wherever in the world will no longer be available. How will you, as humanitarian actors, deal with that? And let me just mention in that context, it was interesting that when in Iceland the volcanic explosion occurred, sending up sheets of ash from that tiny island, the consequence was that you, as humanitarian workers, could not get off the ground in 4 major countries in Europe. So, cybernetic failures. And how about a combination of climate change in Central Asia, where the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, had buried all its nuclear residue. Now, with climate change beginning to dry the area even further, cracking open some of these nuclear receptacles means that we now will have to confront nuclear tailings, not just in Tajikistan, or in Kazakhstan, or in Uzbekistan, but nuclear tailings that can be picked up by the wind and dropped in France, in Sweden, in the United Kingdom. How will you deal with that? How about water stress? An extraordinary problem that we will have to face. And how about viruses? Yes, I know you know all about pandemics. You recognize that it's a threat, but let me just put it, one of the other threats of this, and that is antivirals are becoming less and less effective. We find ourselves less able to keep up with the kind of viruses we have to face. So it's not merely pandemics, but it's the whole dynamics of antivirals. Now, let me also go on and talk a bit about the dynamics of the kind of crises we'll have to face. You know, one of the problems that we've seen is that so many of the kind of issues, be it volcanic, etc., we know about, we've dealt with. But I'd like to put it in a different context. I think if you take a look at the human interface with these kind of threats, therein lies the real threat. It's the interactive nature. For example, when on rivers where, if you like, there's a release of toxins, they pollute rivers with extraordinary consequences across countries. We saw this in Hungary with what was called the red sludge 2 years ago. We'll find more and more that the kind of crises we'll have to face are sequential. In other words, one will trigger another and another, etc. Or others increasingly will become simultaneous. Let me give you an example. Tell me what you're going to do as humanitarian actors in the following situation. There's a major crisis in the Horn of Africa about food security. At the same time, there's a tsunami in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, there is an earthquake in San Francisco. How will you deal with this? Where is the capacity for you to deal with this kind of thing? What kind of training does it take to begin to handle these kind of plausible risks. And then what happens when you have a synchronous failure, as they had in a small part of Canada about 5 years ago, where entire systems go down. It is what one would call a synchronous failure. Everything goes down at once. Hospitals, all of the kind of things that, if you like, we as human beings rely upon. And more, what we find is that crises that we face are global. The pandemics we know about, but the nuclear tailings have we thought about? The cybernetic failures have we thought about? What else is out there that actually changes the whole dimensions of what we'll have to deal with? And isn't it funny, as planners, here in Europe, how many planners have looked at the interface between the kind of potential crises in one country and another, and also the kind of response mechanism? Take a fire engine. If I lend you my fire engine, will your hose fit? Have you begun to think about that? How will you deal with cross-border crises? And what kind of planning will it take? Now, let me just mention something that I think you're all very aware of, but let me put this in my own context. Global transformations. Well, you know all about this. This is what, if you like, I think many of you who read papers every day, think about the changing role of non-governmental organizations, must think about very often. But let me put this in a particular context. I'd like to talk to you very briefly about access. What access will you have in the future? Let me talk about what you call legitimacy and what you call principles. Let me put this in the context of value added, what you have to offer. And by the way, not an unimportant subject to many of you, let me put this in the context of funding. Now, in that way, let's take a look at the global context. I think the first point I'd like to suggest is that as opposed to probably many decades in which we as humanitarian actors have operated, the one thing that we've always felt is that in one way or another, the governments and the countries that we seek to serve will resist, but ultimately, for a whole host of reasons, we can get access. Well, I think this is fundamentally changing. I think increasingly governments are seeing that humanitarian crises will determine in one way or another their survival. Take a look at Turkey. Take a look at Myanmar. Take a look at more and more countries in Central America and Southeast Asia. And what you find is that I may be interested in your technical capacity, but I don't want your boots on the ground. It is too important for my survival to have you try and take over what I do. And in a sense, this is all part of what we're seeing in the change of what you might call post-Western hegemony, that the shift of power is increasingly evident, the shift of resources so, and that with that, while the traditional West may be losing a lot of its power, more and more what we're finding is that other actors, diaspora, private sector, state capitalist structures, and if you like, new states themselves are becoming increasingly, if you like, sources of a new form of hegemony. But if you say, well, this will settle down and this will have a pattern. We've seen alliances and alignments throughout history, and we'll see it once again. I think the unique part that we'll be seeing in this global context is what we call fluid multipolarity. It will be very difficult for you over time to determine who will be aligned with whom or what. Now you can say, but that's a political issue. And I say that will determine whether you have access or not. You may have it one day, but not the next. These alliances will switch, they'll move, and you, if you like, will be left in a state of deep and prolonged uncertainty. And then I'd like to suggest that along with the political centrality of humanitarian action, you'll also find, as we are seeing now, a resurgence of sovereignty. The assumptions about United Nations, about global treaties, about, if you like, regional organizations will first and foremost have to deal with a resurgence of sovereignty where we have not seen an equivalent for literally decades. This is the situation that you'll have to face. You'll also have to face the fact that because humanitarian issues are so central to my government, to my survival, you'll find more and more that there'll be a less supply-driven, what we have to offer as NGOs, and more demand-driven. Don't come here without providing the following. And this, too, will change a lot of your operating presumptions or assumptions. And then there's a great globalization paradox. And that globalization paradox, which you all know, is more and more globalization means localization. But we know that. We know that we need to speak the local languages. We know that, if you like, we have to be sensitive to, if you like, the local and community authorities and government authorities. But do we know that we have to be sensitive to new forms of culture? You know, do we know, for example, that our principles which we regard as universal may not be as universal as we think they are? And how will you deal with that? That last point recalls, for me, a remark from a friend who is an ICRC delegate in the Middle East. And the ICRC delegates, as many of you know, have to go around and perhaps talk a bit about principles and suggest these are the universals that which you might follow since Henri Dunant. And having gone through the principles of independence, neutrality, impartiality, etc., one, as my friend from the ICRC told me, one elegant member of the audience got up and said, and thanked the ICRC representative for his presentation, and said, you know, we have principles too, said this person from, if you like, a particular Middle East country. And our principles begin with justice. Where do your principles and justice fit together? More and more, I think what we'll have to find is that principles will be negotiated and not presumed to be universal. Let me just very briefly say, what does this organization of the future have to look like? Where might you be, and how might you survive in this world of this changing global context? It's interesting to see how very little time is spent on anticipating the what might be's. And the point is not to say, oh, well, I can tell you what the future is. But it is fascinating to try and get and see what happens to an organization when it begins and is allowed to speculate. A point I made, indeed, with a very large French organization at a meeting and they said, but you know, we have people who do this kind of stuff. That's what the policy department does. And I said, yes, but does human resources do this? Does administration think speculatively about the what might be's? And they said, no, why should they? And the whole point here is that unless an organization has the ethos of thinking, of speculating, etc., you end up with a strictly hierarchical stovepipe institution. You have no Apple institution. You have no institution that values speculation and thinking differently, and you just think the same, only in stovepipe situations. I think another thing that the organization of the future will have to think about is being far more adaptive. Speculative is one thing, but how actually do we adjust? And one of the things that I mention very frequently to other organizations is, well, how do you do your strategic planning? And the answer is, well, you know, we have board meetings or council meetings or whatever you have every 3 years, and we prepare a strategy, and then they approve the strategy, and then it goes into the bottom drawer because it has nothing to do with what actually we do. And that's a huge failing. Adaptive capacity should be constantly reviewing your strategy, your objectives, your benchmarks as a permanent way of anticipating, of seeing exactly how close, how prepared you are for dealing with different kind of change. Innovation. Every time I talk to non-governmental organizations about innovation, they say, we're there. And I say, well, give me an example. And they always say, plumpy nut. Well, I think one's going to have to take a far more careful look about what is innovation. How, throughout the great realm of science and scientific opportunities, can you begin to identify the sorts of innovations that you'll have to use for the kind of crises we'll have to face? How do you identify them? How do you prioritize them? How do you implement them? And how do you bring these into a form in which other organizations with whom you work may not have that same capacity? And collaboration. Oh, this is a fun one. Because how and with whom do you collaborate? Well, we collaborate with the private sector, you'll say. And I say, well, what does that mean? Well, through their corporate social responsibility, they, if you like, give us in-kind or cash contribution. And sometimes we benefit from philanthropy, where they just give us cash contribution. That is not the way the world will be functioning. You are faced with a huge humanitarian capacity challenge. You do not have the resources to deal with the kind of dimensions and dynamics that we spoke about earlier. You will have to rely on the private sector for its capacity to develop sustainable situations. These are partners, and if you fail to see them as partners and not as, if you like, the beneficents of philanthropy and corporate social responsibility, you're going to lose on two scales. You're going to lose the capacity challenge because you will not have the capacity to deal with these crises, and you're going to lose on another one because more and more governments will choose Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company, over UNICEF, because UNICEF is a pain. Johnson & Johnson does what we want. So basically, what I'm saying is you have to think differently about how you collaborate and with whom. And then finally, strategic leadership. Throughout the UN, one keeps talking about the strategic leadership. This is a major thrust of so many in the UN system, and dare I say in the NGO system. What is forgotten there is what is the enabling environment that you have created in your organization that will allow strategic leadership to flourish? How much do you anticipate? How adaptive are you? How innovative? What are your partners like? This is the stuff of enabling environments for NGOs. How good are you at promoting that? So finally, Chair, if I may, I asked 4 questions in the beginning. Let me just mention what I think are maybe possible responses. The priority for futures thinking: quit looking for the past as a signpost to the future. Start thinking about the future and start planning from the future. As far as strategic thinking, start thinking about what that future might require, realizing that you'll be wrong so many of the times, but the exercise will mark you from a different type of organization, a 21st century organization, and not a 20th century organization. In terms of your strategy, all too many NGOs, all too many Western organizations dealing with humanitarian assistance look for marginal ways to begin to accommodate certain components of the new futures. The new future will overtake you unless you start changing far more fundamentally than most organizations are willing to. And let me conclude with this. You have to prioritize about longer-term strategic thinking now, because for all intents and purposes, the future really is now. Thank you very much indeed.